In the rolling hills of central Illinois, where prairie grass once whispered its secrets to the wind, a monument to forgotten evil stands, an evil the Catholic Church has spent more than a century trying to erase from history. From Sacred Heart Seminary, the Midwest's most prestigious Catholic institution, 17 young priests and seminarians vanished without a trace between 1847 and 1862. Church records list them as transferred to distant missions or called to extended spiritual retreats. But a different story is told by newly discovered correspondence hidden beneath the seminary's chapel floorboards, a story of systematic abduction, human trafficking, and murder that reached the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority. Particularly chilling is what investigators now believe, that for 15 years, the three men who ran Sacred Heart Seminary weren't priests at all, but Irish criminals who had murdered the original clergy and assumed their identities. For 150 years, the Vatican has sealed these records. But tonight, we're going to tell you what really happened within those hallowed halls, where young men entered seeking God's calling and instead found themselves sold into slavery or worse. Before we continue with the story of Sacred Heart Seminary and the men who disappeared within its walls, understand this channel isn't for everyone, but only for those brave enough to uncover the darkest secrets that institutions try to bury. If you're ready to hear truths that will make you question everything you thought you knew about religious authority, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from, because this story could have happened anywhere in America during those lawless times. Now, let's step back into 1847 and discover how a house of God became a marketplace for human souls. But to understand the full horror of what transpired at Sacred Heart, we must first understand the world that created it and the desperate times that made such evil possible. A turning point in American Catholic history was marked by the year 1847, creating the perfect conditions for the horrors at Sacred Heart Seminary. Hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants poured into American cities, fleeing a devastating potato famine that had killed over 1 million in their homeland, bringing with them a fierce devotion to their faith and an equally fierce suspicion from Protestant neighbors who viewed Catholicism as foreign, dangerous, and fundamentally un-American. So high did anti-Catholic sentiment run that entire cities would erupt in riots at the mere suggestion of Catholic influence. Catholic churches and schools were burned down by nativist mobs in Philadelphia, leaving 13 dead and 50 wounded. In Charlestown, Massachusetts, Protestant crowds destroyed the Ursuline convent, forcing nuns to flee for their lives through back windows while their sacred buildings burned behind them. Regularly, Catholic priests were tarred and feathered in broad daylight, and Catholic families lived in constant fear that their neighbors might turn violent at any moment. In this hostile environment, the Catholic Church desperately needed American-born priests who could speak without an accent, understand local customs, and serve as bridges between the immigrant masses and their new homeland. The church hierarchy recognized that foreign-born clergy, no matter how devout or educated, would always be viewed with suspicion by Protestant Americans who controlled local government, law enforcement, and business establishments. That bridge was designed to be Sacred Heart Seminary, established in 1845 on 400 acres of pristine Illinois prairie, 40 miles southwest of Chicago, a place where young American men could train for the priesthood under the guidance of educated European clergy, creating a new generation of priests who could navigate both worlds successfully. An architectural marvel for its time was the seminary itself. The main building was a massive 3-story brick structure that rose from the prairie like a cathedral, designed by Irish architect Patrick Keele, who had already gained fame for his Gothic revival churches throughout New England. It had soaring windows that reached nearly 20 feet in height, hand-carved wooden pews imported from Bavaria, and a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the flat landscape on clear days. The astronomical sum of $40,000 was spent to construct the building, more than most towns in Illinois were worth at the time, funded entirely by donation. An image of intellectual authority, spiritual devotion, and cultural sophistication was presented by the three men together, impressing even the most skeptical church officials. So convinced of their qualifications was Bishop William Quarter of Chicago, who had ultimate authority over Sacred Heart Seminary, that he granted them unprecedented autonomy in establishing the institution's policies and procedures. The seminary's first class in the fall of 1847 consisted of 12 young men, ages 18 to 25, drawn from Catholic families across the Midwest who had sacrificed significantly to afford the education. They came from diverse backgrounds: Heinrich Müller and Johann Weber, sons of German immigrants in Milwaukee whose families had pooled resources to send them; Patrick Kelly and Sean Malley from prosperous Irish families in Chicago who saw the priesthood as a path to social respectability; Antoine Du Bois from a French family in Detroit that had grown wealthy in the fur trade; and even Thomas Morrison and David Anderson, converts from Protestant families who had embraced Catholicism despite fierce opposition from their relatives. With hearts full of religious devotion and minds eager to serve God, these young men arrived, completely unaware that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap that had been months in the planning. Specific criteria established by the three false priests had been used to carefully select each student: family wealth sufficient to pay the substantial tuition fees, physical strength suitable for heavy labor, educational background that would make them valuable in skilled positions, and social isolation that would make their disappearance easier to explain and harder to investigate. Traditional seminary practices established by centuries of Catholic education appeared to be followed by the daily routine at Sacred Heart. At 4:30 a.m., students rose for Lauds, the first prayer service of the day, attended Mass at 5 a.m. in the seminary's magnificent chapel, and spent their days in a carefully structured routine of prayer, study, and manual labor maintaining the seminary's extensive grounds. Rigorous and comprehensive was their academic curriculum, including Latin grammar and composition, Greek language and literature, philosophy covering ancient and medieval thought, systematic theology examining church doctrine, church history from the apostolic age to the present, moral theology addressing ethical questions, canon law governing church administration, homiletics, teaching sermon preparation and delivery, biblical studies focusing on both Old and New Testaments. Strict discipline was maintained by the three priests, who insisted on absolute obedience to authority, a requirement they justified as essential preparation for the hierarchical nature of church leadership. Without written permission, students were forbidden from leaving the seminary grounds, from corresponding with family members more than once per month, and from discussing seminary affairs with outsiders during their rare visits to the nearby town of Millfield. As a spiritual necessity, this isolation was presented, but it served the darker purpose of preventing students from developing outside relationships that might interfere with the trafficking operation. All incoming and outgoing mail was carefully monitored by the priests, ostensibly to ensure that students maintained proper spiritual focus, but actually to control information flow and prevent any communication that might expose their criminal activities. Just 5 months after the seminary opened, the first disappearance occurred on a bitter February morning in 1848, during one of the worst blizzards in Illinois history. For 3 days, snow had fallen continuously, piling into drifts that reached the second-story windows and making travel impossible on the surrounding roads. Precisely the kind of weather the false priests had been waiting for were these conditions, providing perfect cover for their operation while making immediate investigation impossible. Particular promise in his theological studies had been shown by Michael Brennan, a 22-year-old from a prosperous Irish family in Chicago, who had been selected by Father Walsh to assist with special administrative duties that required access to the seminary's financial records and correspondence files. 3 successful grocery stores serving Chicago's growing Irish community were owned by his family, who had paid the substantial sum of $200 per year for his education, money they had saved for over 5 years, believing they were investing in their son's future as a priest and their own family's standing in the community. Just days before his disappearance, Michael had written to his family, describing his joy at being selected for advanced responsibilities and his excitement about beginning specialized studies in moral theology. Found later among Walsh's papers, his letter spoke of his deep gratitude for his parents' sacrifice and his determination to serve God and the Irish community with distinction. No hint of distress, doubt, or any desire to leave the seminary was borne by the letter. After the evening meal on the evening of February 13, 1848, Michael was summoned to Father Walsh's private office. Around 8:30 p.m., several students remembered seeing him walk down the corridor toward Walsh's office, carrying a small leather portfolio containing his academic work. A remote section of the seminary's administrative wing housed the office, separated from the student dormitories by thick stone walls that muffled sound transmission. From students who were questioned about that evening, later testimony stated that raised voices could be heard coming from Walsh's office sometime around 9 p.m., though the specific words were indistinguishable. For nearly an hour, the argument, for that's what it clearly was, continued, with periods of silence punctuated by shouting that seemed to involve multiple voices. Around 10:15 p.m., the sound ceased abruptly, and an unsettling quiet settled over the administrative wing. Until nearly midnight, Joseph Kennedy, Michael's roommate and closest friend at the seminary, waited for Michael to return to their shared dormitory room. When Michael failed to appear by morning prayers at 4:30 a.m., Joseph assumed his friend had been given permission to sleep late due to his administrative duties. It wasn't until Father Walsh announced to the assembled students after morning mass that Joseph learned the official explanation for Michael's absence. With apparent sorrow and concern, standing at the ornate wooden pulpit that dominated the seminary chapel, Walsh delivered the news. An urgent call during the night to minister to cholera victims in a remote settlement near the Iowa border was what Michael had received, he explained. A small Catholic community had been struck by the disease, and their local priest had died, leaving the faithful without spiritual guidance during their hour of greatest need. The kind of selfless courage that marked a true priestly calling had been demonstrated by Michael, who, despite his youth and incomplete training, had volunteered for this dangerous mission. On the surface, Walsh's explanation seemed reasonable, especially given the genuine cholera outbreaks that periodically devastated frontier communities during the 1840s. A terrifying disease was cholera, which could kill healthy adults within hours, and priests who ministered to victims faced almost certain death themselves. The kind of heroic narrative that inspired other seminarians and reinforced their own sense of calling was exactly the image of young Michael sacrificing his safety to serve God and the faithful. However, troubling details that didn't align with the official story were noticed by Joseph Kennedy. Most obviously, Michael's heavy winter coat remained hanging in their shared wardrobe along with his warmest boots and thick woolen gloves, items that would be absolutely essential for travel during an Illinois February, especially to reach a remote settlement in Iowa. The previous night, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, making survival impossible for anyone traveling without proper winter clothing. Even more disturbing was that Michael had mentioned nothing to Joseph about any possible call to ministry, despite the two young men sharing their deepest spiritual thoughts and concerns every evening before sleep. Just the night before Michael's disappearance, they had discussed their future plans, and Michael had spoken enthusiastically about his administrative work and his hopes of specializing in moral theology. No signs of restlessness, dissatisfaction, or desire for immediate ministry experience had been shown by him. Also noticed by Joseph was that Michael's personal belongings remained exactly as he had left them, including his most treasured possession, a silver rosary that had belonged to his grandmother, who had died during the Irish potato famine. Since arriving at the seminary, Michael had never been seen without this rosary, and Joseph found it inconceivable that his friend would depart for dangerous missionary work without taking this sacred family heirloom. When Joseph privately questioned Father Walsh about these inconsistencies the following day, the priest's reaction was swift, severe, and completely disproportionate to the nature of the inquiry. Prideful curiosity incompatible with proper religious obedience and dangerous skepticism toward legitimate church authority were what Walsh accused Joseph of harboring. Such attitudes, Walsh warned, could lead to spiritual corruption and ultimate damnation if not corrected through severe penance and spiritual discipline. For his presumptuous questioning, as punishment, Joseph was assigned to spend the next week in solitary prayer and fasting in the seminary's basement chapel, a damp, windowless room beneath the main structure where students were sent to contemplate their spiritual failings and seek God's forgiveness. Directly into the hillside beneath the seminary was where the basement chapel was carved, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that descended from the main building's rear entrance. A deliberately uncomfortable space designed to encourage genuine repentance through physical hardship was the basement chapel. Rough-hewn stone that wept moisture continuously formed the walls, creating an atmosphere of perpetual dampness that chilled to the bone. From candles that students were required to maintain themselves came the only light, and from a small brazier that provided minimal heat during the worst winter weather came the only warmth. During his week of isolation in this underground chamber, Joseph experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Late at night, usually around 2 a.m., when the seminary was supposed to be completely silent, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of horses' hooves and wagon wheels on the frozen ground outside the basement chapel. Despite the thick stone walls, the sounds were clear and distinct, suggesting that the activity was taking place directly above his underground prison. A consistent pattern was followed by the nocturnal activity, becoming more disturbing with each occurrence. First came the sound of horses approaching from the direction of the main road, moving slowly and carefully, as if the drivers were familiar with the terrain but wanted to avoid making unnecessary noise. Next came voices speaking in hushed tones, always the same three voices that Joseph recognized as belonging to Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, though he could never make out their specific words through the stone ceiling. Typically, the conversations lasted about 15 minutes, followed by the sounds of heavy objects being moved, dragging noises, grunting sounds suggesting physical exertion, and the creaking of wagon springs adjusting to shifting weight. During these periods, Joseph could see lantern light flickering through the basement chapel's single dirt-encrusted window, casting moving shadows on the stone walls that suggested multiple figures working in coordination. Typically, the entire process took about an hour, always ending with the sound of wagon wheels departing in the direction opposite from their arrival, toward the road leading to Springfield rather than Chicago. After the wagons departed, complete silence would return to the seminary, and the next morning would proceed exactly as if nothing unusual had occurred. On the third night of his confinement, Joseph positioned himself directly beneath the basement chapel's window and managed to catch a clearer glimpse of the activity above. Through the dirty glass, he could see the silhouettes of three men loading what appeared to be a large, heavy bundle into the back of a covered wagon. The bundle was wrapped in dark cloth and required all three men to lift, suggesting considerable weight. Most chilling was the care with which they handled their burden, not the rough treatment appropriate for cargo or supplies, but the cautious movements used when transporting something precious or fragile. Just 6 weeks after Michael Brennan's vanishing came the second disappearance, and this time the pattern became impossible for observant students to ignore. As the gentlest, most devout member of their class was universally regarded Thomas Gallagher, the 20-year-old son of a German immigrant family from Milwaukee. He spent extra hours in private prayer, helped struggling classmates with their Latin translations, and had never been known to raise his voice or express anger about anything. A family that embodied the American dream through hard work and sacrifice was where Thomas came from. His father, Klaus Gallagher, originally Klaus Müller before anglicizing his name upon arrival in America, had started as a day laborer in Milwaukee's growing brewery industry and had worked his way up to become foreman of one of the city's largest operations. His mother, Anna, took in sewing and laundry to supplement the family income, working 16-hour days to help save money for Thomas's seminary education. Enormously had the Gallaghers sacrificed to afford Sacred Heart's tuition, selling their small farm outside Milwaukee and moving into a cramped tenement apartment so they could dedicate every possible dollar to their son's religious calling. Heavily, Thomas carried the weight of his family's sacrifice, frequently expressing to fellow students his determination to justify their faith in him and to serve God with the dedication their generosity deserved. Immediately after evening prayers on the evening of March 30, 1848, Thomas was summoned to Father Walsh's private office. Through Dean Patrick O'Brien came the summons, who approached Thomas in the seminary chapel with an unusually grave expression and whispered instructions that he was needed for urgent consultation regarding his academic progress. Confused by the summons appeared Thomas, telling his closest friend, Heinrich Weber, that he was unaware of any problems with his studies and couldn't imagine what urgent matter required immediate attention. From Walsh's office beginning around 9 p.m. and continuing intermittently until nearly 11 p.m., several students positioned in dormitory rooms near the administrative wing reported hearing raised voices. Multiple participants appeared to be involved in the conversation, with periods of calm discussion interrupted by what sounded like arguments or heated disagreements. At several points, students later testified that they heard Thomas's voice, sounding distressed and increasingly agitated as the evening progressed. Around 10:30 p.m., long after the seminary's mandatory evening silence was supposed to begin, Heinrich Weber and 2 other students reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved or overturned in Walsh's office, followed by a period of complete silence that lasted nearly 30 minutes. Then, around 11 p.m., they heard the familiar sound of a horse-drawn wagon departing from behind the seminary building, traveling slowly with muffled wheels as if the drivers were attempting to minimize noise. The next morning, during Mass, Father Walsh announced that Thomas had experienced what he termed a profound spiritual crisis during their evening consultation. Thomas had confessed to struggling with impure thoughts incompatible with priestly vocation and had reached the painful conclusion that he was not suited for religious life. To join a contemplative monastery in the Wisconsin wilderness had been what Thomas had voluntarily done before dawn, rather than face the shame of public failure, where years of silence and isolation would help him overcome his spiritual struggles and perhaps eventually qualify him for a different form of religious service. With psychological sophistication was Walsh's explanation crafted, playing upon common fears and anxieties that many seminary students experienced. A genuine struggle for young men committed to celibacy was sexual temptation, and the shame associated with such feelings often led to extreme measures of self-punishment and isolation. Entirely plausible and consistent with traditional Catholic approaches to spiritual crisis was the idea of a troubled student seeking redemption through monastic retreat. However, as with Michael Brennan's Disappearance, troubling details emerged for those who looked closely at the official explanation. His most precious possession, a rosary hand-carved by his dying mother, which he had never been seen without since arriving at the seminary, had been left behind by Thomas. Carefully placed on his dormitory desk was the rosary, suggesting deliberate placement rather than forgotten abandonment. Even more suspicious was that Thomas had departed so suddenly that he hadn't collected the $50 in personal funds that his family had provided for incidental expenses, money that remained locked in Father Walsh's office safe. For a family that had sacrificed so much to afford seminary tuition, abandoning $50 represented a financial loss that would have a significant impact on their daily survival. Most disturbing of all was an unfinished letter Thomas had been writing to his younger sister, Maria, which remained on his desk. Mid-sentence, in a description of his joy at serving God and his excitement about beginning advanced theological studies in the coming term, the letter stopped. The final line read, "I wake each morning grateful to God for guiding me to this holy place where I grow closer to Him each day, and I cannot imagine any life more blessed than the one He has." Abruptly, the sentence ended, as if Thomas had been interrupted while writing. Particularly disturbing did Heinrich Weber, Thomas's closest friend at the seminary, find the incomplete letter, because Thomas had shared the contents with him the evening before his disappearance. About describing to Maria his progress in theological studies and his growing confidence in his calling to priesthood had Thomas been enthusiastic. The following day, he had planned to finish the letter and had specifically mentioned wanting to tell Maria about a particularly inspiring lecture Father Walsh had delivered on moral theology. In whispers and never in the presence of the three priests, word of the disappearances began to spread among the remaining students. Now, the student body, originally of 12, had lost 2 members in just 6 weeks, and the official explanations, while individually plausible, began to seem suspicious when considered together. Some students defended the priests' accounts, arguing that God's call could come suddenly and that true devotion sometimes required abandoning worldly attachments, including family relationships and material possessions. However, others began to notice patterns that filled them with growing unease. Among the most financially well-off students had both Michael and Thomas been. Both had demonstrated exceptional academic promise that made them valuable additions to any religious community, and both had been called to private meetings with Father Walsh shortly before their departures. Additionally, both had left behind personal possessions that seemed inconsistent with voluntary departure, and both had shown no previous signs of doubt, distress, or desire to leave the seminary. In subtle but unmistakable ways, the atmosphere at Sacred Heart began to change. In their conversations, students became more guarded, more careful about expressing opinions or asking questions that might be interpreted as challenging authority. An undercurrent of anxiety and suspicion that affected every aspect of daily life gave way to the easy camaraderie that had characterized the seminary's early months. With terrifying regularity that revealed the systematic nature of the operation, the disappearances at Sacred Heart Seminary continued as the harsh Illinois winter gradually gave way to spring. By Christmas of 1848, 5 more young men had vanished from the institution. Each departure was accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations from the 3 false priests that demonstrated their growing confidence in their ability to manipulate both students and outside authorities. The third disappearance involved Antoine Du Bois, the French seminarian from Detroit whose family had made their fortune in the fur trade. Valuable skills in wilderness survival, animal tracking, and Native American languages were possessed by Antoine, making him particularly attractive to buyers seeking workers for frontier operations. During a supposed emergency call to minister to a remote French settlement that was allegedly under threat from hostile Native American tribes, he vanished. The fourth was Heinrich Weber, Thomas Gallagher's closest friend, who had begun asking too many questions about his roommate's sudden departure. To a specialized seminary in Baltimore that focused on preparing priests for German immigrant communities was where Heinrich was reportedly transferred, a transfer that required such secrecy that he was forbidden from saying goodbye to his fellow students or writing to inform his family until he was safely established in his new location. From 12 to 7 had the student body shrunk by the end of 1848, and those who remained lived in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing who might be next to receive that dreaded summons to Father Walsh's office. An unspoken system of mutual protection was developed by the survivors, noting who was called away for private meetings and making mental inventories of their fellow students' most valued possessions as a way of monitoring whose departure might be imminent. Unable to concentrate on his theological studies found himself Joseph Kennedy, who had witnessed the first disappearance of his roommate, Michael, and had endured a week of solitary confinement for questioning the official explanation. Him haunted the memory of those late-night sounds from the basement chapel, and he began paying careful attention to patterns and details that he had previously dismissed as unimportant. That disappearances always occurred during specific weather conditions was noticed by Joseph: cold, overcast nights when travel would be difficult but concealment would be easier. During the week rather than on weekends, when visiting family members or church officials might be present on the seminary grounds, they typically happened. Most significantly, they always followed private meetings with Father Walsh that lasted significantly longer than normal academic consultations. Changes in the three priests that seemed inconsistent with their claimed backgrounds and spiritual calling also began to be observed by the surviving students. Father Walsh, who had arrived at Sacred Heart with modest belongings and simple clerical garments, now wore silk vestments during Mass that had obviously cost more than most priests earned in a year. An expensive gold pocket watch manufactured in Switzerland had been acquired by him, which he consulted frequently during his lectures, and new furniture for his private office that included a mahogany desk imported from Ireland had been purchased by him. Somehow, Rector Murphy had obtained funds to purchase new leather-bound books for the seminary library, volumes that cost more than most families earned in a month and included rare theological works that would normally be found only in major European universities. Spectacles with gold frames had also begun to be worn by him, and a seal ring that he claimed bore his family coat of arms had been acquired by him, though none of the Irish students recognized the symbols as belonging to any legitimate Irish family. Perhaps the most dramatic change in circumstances had been shown by Dean O'Brien, acquiring a magnificent black stallion that he claimed was a gift from grateful parishioners in his former parish in Ireland. Clearly a thoroughbred worth several $100s was the horse, and riding skills that seemed more appropriate to a wealthy landowner than a humble parish priest were demonstrated by O'Brien. Regular trips to Chicago had also been begun by him, ostensibly for church business, but always returning with new possessions and an air of satisfaction that suggested successful commercial transactions rather than spiritual consultations. Frequent trips away from the seminary, sometimes for several days at a time, also began to be taken by the three men, claiming to visit church officials in Chicago, Milwaukee, or St. Louis. By Francis McManus, the elderly lay brother who had arrived at Sacred Heart at the same time as the three priests and seemed to serve as their assistant and confidant, the remaining students were supervised during these absences. A peculiar figure who generated considerable unease among the students was McManus. Very little did he speak, moved with a furtive, nervous manner, and seemed perpetually frightened of something he never identified. He would become visibly agitated and refuse to answer direct questions when students attempted to engage him in conversation about his background or his work at the seminary. His reaction whenever anyone mentioned the missing students was most disturbing. He would immediately change the subject or find urgent work that required him to leave the area. That McManus possessed detailed knowledge of the seminary's grounds that suggested extensive familiarity with areas that were supposedly off-limits to everyone except the priests was noticed by several students. The locations of storage areas, root cellars, and outbuildings that were never mentioned in official tours of the facility were known to him. Knowledge of the surrounding countryside that seemed inconsistent with his claimed role as a religious assistant who rarely left the seminary grounds was also demonstrated by him. Perhaps most disturbing was the seminary's correspondence with the outside world, which revealed a level of control and deception that suggested careful planning and systematic implementation. On official Sacred Heart letterhead, family members who wrote to inquire about their sons received responses, but the handwriting was always that of Father Walsh, never the students themselves. Consistent patterns that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry while providing plausible explanations for reduced communication were followed by the letters. That advanced theological studies required periods of spiritual silence during which students were forbidden from worldly communication that might distract from their religious development was what families who requested specific information about their sons' well-being, academic progress, or daily activities were told. That such correspondence would be permitted only after successful completion of specific spiritual milestones that might take months or years to achieve was what families who asked for direct letters from their sons were informed. About strange occurrences near the seminary that seemed inconsistent with the quiet, contemplative atmosphere appropriate to a religious institution began to whisper the local community in the nearby town of Millfield, population barely 300. At odd hours along the rarely used road that connected Sacred Heart to the main highway toward Chicago, farmers reported seeing covered wagons traveling, always moving slowly and carefully as if attempting to avoid detection. Samuel Morrison, who owned the farm adjacent to the seminary property, claimed to have found personal items scattered along the fence line that separated his land from the seminary grounds. The items included a prayer book with Michael Brennan written inside the front cover, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that had belonged to Heinrich Weber, and a silver crucifix that several people recognized as having been worn by Thomas Gallagher. That they had been deliberately discarded by students who were learning to abandon worldly attachments as part of their spiritual development was what Father Walsh claimed when Morrison attempted to return these items to the seminary. A series of events that would fundamentally transform the nature of the mystery surrounding Sacred Heart Seminary and reveal the true scope of the horror that had been unfolding behind the facade of religious education was brought by the winter of 1849 to 1850. Perfect conditions for the criminals to accelerate their operations while making detection or escape virtually impossible for their victims were created by the seminary's isolation during Illinois' brutal winter months. Increasingly suspicious of the priest's explanations for his missing classmates had grown James O'Malley, a seminary student from Detroit whose father was a prosperous merchant with extensive connections throughout the Great Lakes region. Unlike the other students, who came primarily from working-class immigrant families with limited resources and political influence, James had connections to influential Catholics in multiple cities, including his uncle, Father Patrick O'Malley, who served as secretary to the Bishop of Detroit and corresponded regularly with church officials throughout the Midwest. Advantages that made him particularly dangerous to the trafficking operation were possessed by James. His family's wealth meant that his disappearance would be noticed and investigated by people with the resources to pursue inquiries across state lines. His uncle's position in the church hierarchy provided access to communication networks that could bypass local control and reach authorities in Rome if necessary. Most importantly, James had received a classical education that included training in logic, rhetoric, and investigation techniques that made him capable of systematic analysis and evidence gathering. Beginning in the fall of 1849, James started conducting his own investigation into the disappearances, carefully documenting discrepancies in the priest's stories and maintaining detailed records of which students had disappeared and under what circumstances. A detailed timeline that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation was created by him, including the fact that all disappearances had occurred during specific weather conditions and that the official explanations contained internal contradictions that became obvious when examined systematically. That the three priests seemed to possess detailed knowledge of each student's family financial situation was noticed by James, information that would normally be kept confidential in church records and would only be available to someone who had conducted thorough investigations into each family's background. Which students came from wealthy families, which had agricultural land that could be used as collateral, and which had relatives in other cities who might provide assistance in times of crisis was known by the priests. Most significantly, James discovered that the seminary's financial records contained discrepancies that suggested income far exceeding what would be expected from tuition payments alone. By carefully observing the priests' spending patterns and comparing them to the seminary's official budget, James calculated that Sacred Heart was generating several $1,000s in unexplained revenue each year, money that had to be coming from sources other than student fees or church donations. In December 1849, when he discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath loose floorboards in the seminary's library, concealed in a space that appeared to have been deliberately constructed to hide documents from casual inspection, came the breakthrough in James's investigation. Sophisticated was the hiding place, involving a section of flooring that could be removed only by manipulating specific boards in a precise sequence, suggesting that it had been designed by someone with detailed knowledge of carpentry and security techniques. In various hands and bearing postmarks from cities across the Midwest, the letters, written, appeared to be communications between Father Walsh and unknown correspondents who were clearly involved in commercial transactions of some kind. A peculiar code that mixed legitimate business terminology with religious language in ways that seemed designed to disguise the true nature of the discussions was how the correspondence was written. Weeks analyzing the coded language were spent by James, using his classical education and knowledge of multiple languages to decipher meanings that became increasingly horrifying as he understood more of the system. Merchandise of varying quality was discussed in the letters, and delivery schedules to locations in Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois were negotiated. That the merchandise was human beings who were being evaluated and sold based on their characteristics and capabilities was made clear by references to prime specimens, educational background, and physical condition. Dated November 15, 1849, one letter contained references that made James's blood run cold and confirmed his worst suspicions about what had happened to his missing classmates. The letter read in part: the latest shipment included 2 prime specimens, both young and strong, suitable for heavy labor. The German boy brought premium price due to his education and physical condition. Buyers in the coal regions are particularly interested in educated workers who can serve as overseers for immigrant crews. The Irish lad was sold separately to lumber interests in Wisconsin, where his literacy skills make him valuable for record keeping. Both transactions completed without complications. That he was looking at evidence of human trafficking on a massive scale, with his missing classmates being systematically sold as slaves to mining operations, lumber companies, and industrial concerns across the Midwest, was realized by James. That educated young men, particularly those from Catholic families, commanded high prices because their religious training made them trustworthy overseers, while their social isolation made their disappearances easier to explain and harder to investigate was indicated by the letters. That the operation was far more sophisticated than a simple kidnapping scheme was revealed by the correspondence. Throughout multiple states, the criminals had established networks of buyers, had developed systems for transporting victims without detection, and had created elaborate cover stories that could withstand casual investigation by family members or church officials. Pricing structures that treated human beings as commodities to be evaluated and sold based on market demand were revealed by further analysis of the letters. Between $300 and $500 depending on their physical condition, language skills, and family background were commanded by young men with theological education. Premium prices of up to $800 were brought by those with specialized knowledge, carpentry, bookkeeping, or foreign languages. A reference to damaged goods that had to be permanently disposed of when they proved unsuitable for resale was most chilling. Armed with this evidence, James attempted to contact church authorities outside Sacred Heart to report his discoveries. However, he quickly discovered that his correspondence was being intercepted and read before being sent. When he tried to send a coded message to his uncle in Detroit using Latin phrases that would be meaningless to casual readers but would alert Father Patrick to serious problems, the letter was returned to him with a note from Father Walsh claiming that ecclesiastical correspondence required official review to ensure proper theological content. That he was trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation was realized by James. The 3 criminals now knew that he suspected something, and they had demonstrated their willingness to murder anyone who threatened their operation. His only hope lay in gathering enough evidence to expose the entire network before they decided to eliminate him, as they had eliminated others who had grown too suspicious. On a frigid January evening in 1850, when Father Walsh summoned him to his private office after evening prayers, came the confrontation that James had been dreading. That his life was in immediate danger entered James the meeting, but hoping that his family connections and social position might provide some protection against the immediate violence that had claimed his classmates. Since James's last visit several months earlier, the office had been transformed. The stone floor was covered with expensive carpets. The walls were decorated with oil paintings in elaborate gold frames, and papers and ledgers that suggested extensive business activities covered the massive mahogany desk. Most ominous was the presence of Dean O'Brien and Rector Murphy, who stood flanking Walsh's desk like bodyguards rather than fellow priests. Completely different from the pastoral, scholarly persona he maintained in public was Walsh's demeanour during the confrontation. In the harsh accent of Dublin's criminal districts, speaking, he dropped all pretense of religious authority and addressed James with the calculating coldness of a businessman protecting